Now, speaking of morale, next section is about morale. A World War II Blue Jacket said it this way. Blue Jacket's a term for Navy guys. Said it this way. Morale is when your hands and feet keep working when your head says it can't be done. The handiest beginning is to consider morale in conjunction with discipline. Since in military service, they are opposite sides of the same coin. When one is present, the other will also be there. Morale and discipline. Morale and discipline, they go together. This is a familiar story. It was repeated by the United States forces in World War II during the Normandy hedgerow fighting and the invasions of the Central Pacific atolls. Troops had to learn the hard way how to hit, how to survive in moving through jungle or across mountains and the desert. When that happened, the only disciplinary residue which mattered was obedience to orders. The movements they had learned by rote were of less value than the spiritual bond between one man and another. The most valuable lesson was that of mutual support. So this is awesome. The moves, the battle moves that they learned, that they trained, that were hard and put them through this hard war, getting ready to deploy overseas. When they got overseas, they were fighting in a hedgerow. They never did that before. They're fighting in a mountain. They never did that before. So they had to take these drills that they had learned and kind of throw them out the window. So all they had left, and the most valuable thing of all that training, wasn't the movements themselves. It was the spiritual bond between these men. That was more important than the tactical maneuvers, was the fact that they did hard training together and they worked together and they knew each other and they had that spiritual bond. Back to the book. In its essentials, discipline is not measured according to how a man keeps step in a drill yard or whether he salutes at just the right angle. The test is how well he willingly responds to his superiors in all vital matters. And finally, whether he stands or runs when his life is at stake. History makes this clear. There are countless examples of successful military forces which had almost no discipline when measured by the usual yardsticks, yet had a high battle morale productive of the kind of discipline which beats the enemy in battle. So that's another little dichotomy, he's talking about. Like, you might not be the most disciplined on the parade field, but if you got that bond, or you got that discipline bond, you can still come up with the victory. This is important. Back to the book. Man is able to recognize a right and reasonable discipline as such, even though it causes him personal inconvenience, because he has acquired a sense of military values. But if it is either unduly harsh or unnecessarily lax, he likewise knows it and wears it as a hair shirt to the undoing of his morale. Though the man, like the group, can be hurt by being pushed beyond sensible limits, his spirit will suffer even more sorely if no real test is put upon his abilities and moral powers. The greater his intelligence, the stronger will be his resentment. That is the law of nature. The enlightened mind has always the greatest measure of self-discipline, but it also has a higher sense of what constitutes justice, fair play, and a reasonable requirement in the performance of duty. If denied these things, he will come to hold his chief, his job, and himself in contempt. So if you're a military leader, or if you're a civilian leader, and you get the idea, okay, Jocko's talking about discipline. Discipline's key. So you're going to come in and just throw discipline on your people and burden them with this heavy realm of discipline. It's not going to work out, because everyone knows that it's unjust, unfair, unnecessary. We don't want that unnecessary discipline, but we might not outwardly, but we deep inside, we embrace the hardcore discipline if it makes sense and has meaning. Mm-hmm. Admiral Ben Muriel has stated a formula in understanding terms by his explanation of what made the Seabees notable for competence and devotion to duty during World War II. What he said is this: we used artisans to do the work for which they had been trained in civilian life. They were well led by officers who spoke their language. We made them feel that they were playing an important part in a great adventure, and thus they achieved a high standard of morale. The elements underscored by Admiral Muriel deserve special note: satisfaction in a work program, mutual confidence between leaders and ranks, conviction that all together were striving for something more important than themselves. Talking about the Seabees, the construction battalions in the Navy that do engineering work overseas. And I actually had Seabees with us in Ramadi that were awesome guys that did everything for us. They kept everything going, kept everything running, kept everything working, built everything that we used. Awesome guys. And every CB I've ever worked with has been just a beast. They have that attitude. Like, they know they're going to make their motto is can do. And believe me, when you tell them to do something, they're 100% into that motto right there. They're going to make it happen. Here we go back to the book, talking about morale. Under training conditions or in combat, the mental ills and the resulting moral and physical deterioration which sometimes beset military forces cannot be cured simply by the intensification of disciplinary methods. You can't just turn it up. Mm-hmm. It is true that the signs of a recovery will sometimes attend the installation of a more rigid or less rigid discipline. You can't just go up or down. The onset is in fact usually due to the collateral influence of an increased confidence in the command, whereby men are made to feel that their own fortunes are on the mend. Then discipline and morale are together revitalized almost as if by throwing an electric switch. In Army history, there's no better example of the working of this principle than the work of Brigadier General Paul B. Malone. He took over, this is World War I, 1919. He took over a command where slackness and indiscipline were general. The men were suffering terrible privation, and too many of their officers were indifferent to their needs. Many of them had been battle casualties. Some had been discharged from hospitals before their wounds were healed. The mess was abominable. The camp was short of firewood and other supply. In freezing weather, men were sleeping on the ground with only a pair of blankets apiece. The death toll from influenza, pneumonia, and the aggravation of battle wounds rose daily. Despair and resentment over these conditions began to express itself in semi-violent form. Every fresh breath of discipline was countered with harassing punishments until an air of wretched stagnation hung over the whole camp. General Pershing visited the base. The men refused to form for him. The generals coming and the men were not going to form up for him. When he tried to address them at a mass meeting, they wouldn't hear him out. Instead of taking any action against the men, he sent for General Malone. The new commander arrived without any instructions except to determine what was wrong and correct it. With soldierly instinct, he recognized that the indiscipline of the camp was an effect and not a cause. But even as he gave orders for relieving the physical distress of the men, he demanded that they return to orderly habits. He walked around the areas. Already on his orders, duckboards were being laid throughout the mud, and the whole physical setup was in a process of reorganization. The men, grown listless from weeks of mistreatment, paid no heed. "Get on your feet. I'm your general. I respect you, but I want your respect," were his words. They restored the whole situation. The first impact of this one man on the camp that was never forgotten by anyone who saw it. It is a point to remember. A firm hold at the beginning pays tenfold dividend of the timid approach, followed by a show of firmness later on. Within 48 hours, the physical condition of the camp was showing improvement, and 60,000 men were again doing their duty and bearing themselves in a military manner. The lessons from this one incident stand out like beams from a searchlight battery. Leadership. One man is able to accomplish a miracle by an act of will accompanied by good works. The morale of the force flows from self-discipline of the commander. And in turn, the discipline of the force is reestablished by the upsurge of its moral power. Another example here, when the redeployment period which followed World War II threatened a complete collapse to the morale of the general military establishment, the remedy attempted by some unit leaders was to relax discipline and the work requirement all around. Other officers met this crisis by improving the conditions of work, setting an example which proved to the men that they believed in its importance and paying sedulous attention to the personal problems of those within the unit. They found that they could still get superior performance in the midst of chaos. Organic strength materializes in the same way on the field of war. However adverse the general situation, men will stick to the one man who knows what he wants to do and welcomes them to a full share in the enterprise. Leadership, leadership, and leadership. Most important thing on the battlefield.